Michael, when I was up that tree and I heard those wolves, it was about, it was getting really late at night. The shadows were really long. The cool breeze had started that comes with evening. And I had about, probably 3-4 miles from our main base camp and a half hour to get there. Now, I was just ready to leave that tree anyway when all of a sudden the most horrible scream and howl I've ever heard came from where I had tied my horse about 200 yards away to walk into this tree to use it as a tree stand in hunting elk. About a half a second after that howl, there was another one, and another one, and another one. I was listening to 4 distinct voices coming from where I had tied my horse, and in the midst of the howling and the carrying on that way, my poor horse was screaming desperately. She was letting out a scream from 200 yards away that almost deafened you. She was in a panic situation. The harassment and things going on with the wolves there was unbearable to her. And in my mind, I was thinking, they're going to hamstring that horse. Those wolves are attacking my horse, and in desperation, I had to save her. I'd borrowed the horse. I'd had some problems before, and with one of mine, and one of my friends had lent me this beautiful, big, strong animal to carry me in the mountains and hunt with, and I'd hunted on horses for years, and this is one of the best, finest saddle horse that I'd ever had the opportunity to use or to ride. I sailed out of that tree as fast as I could in desperation to get there so that they wouldn't hurt her, and I had about 200 yards to run. And as I started running towards the horse, or where she was, and could hear the voices and things of the wolves, in figuring what I could do to save her before, so they hopefully wouldn't ruin her before I got there, I figured if they hear me, they'll leave, because most of the time wolves are scared of humans, and they know that with humans is killing them and things that way. And there's an inborn fear of human beings with most wild animals. And so I started screaming, and as I ran as fast as I could, screaming at the wolves, and I don't remember the things I was saying. What I was trying to do more than anything was just scream loud enough that they would hear me coming and leave the horse. And it took me a couple of minutes to run that couple hundred yards, and when I got there, you should have seen the shape of that horse. The harassment with those wolves, where that horse was tied with a halter rope to a tree, and the horse could not get away. They had not hurt her physically as far as tearing her flesh or hamstringing her, biting her bad, and things like this. But in her protecting herself by kicking her hind legs and things at the wolves, she was like a person in hysterics. She was in total convulsions. There wasn't one muscle on her body that wasn't in full convulsions. She could hardly stand. She was scared so bad that it was hard to get her calmed down enough to even ride out of the area. But in taking 5 minutes calming her down, and there was wolf tracks all over around that tree in the plowed up ground from her feet, and kicking at the wolves and things like this. I was lucky to have a horse that wasn't totally ruined. I put my rifle in the scabbard and mounted her, and off we went. And back home we went. And Michael, I didn't think I was going to get to camp before dark, but it was really hard to control that horse. As much as I've ridden horses all my life, it was hard to control that horse to keep her from a dead run. We made it to camp before dark, to our main camp, and that horse was a long time before she even settled down. I had an interesting situation there. I've hunted that area many times since then, but 2 years after, I was able to hunt the same exact area that this experience with these wolves had happened. I was on the same horse. I still have that same horse today. And this was in 1978 that this happened. But in riding that horse back there 2 years later, when we got to the same area that those wolves had attacked her the 2 years before, I could tell it was in the same area, not necessarily from looking at the trees or the country and things like that, but I could tell by the actions of that horse. She started shaking. She was nervous. She was excited. Any little teeny tiny movement, she jumped sideways. She was almost back in the point of being in convulsions like she was before, just from being in the same area and sensing what happened to her 2 years later. And that amazed me. I didn't know a horse could remember details like that, but she could. She knew where she was at. One of the things I want to tell you right quick too is, with this experience with these wolves in the UNM Mountains here in Utah, hunting that same area up there is a sheep herder and his wife. Now he's about 75 and she's probably in her early 70s, and that's pretty old for a couple to go back in there in that rough a country on pack horses and hunt out. But they do this every year in this area. They've hunted that for 17 years. They go back in first of the elk season and stay the whole season. They have had, over those years, they had 3 experiences with the same, we imagine, the same pack of wolves. The lady is a good hunter too, and she carries a little 30-30 rifle, and she over the years has taken 3 real nice bull elk out of that area. But she'll take her knitting and she'll go down and sit in a meadow that's maybe 400 or 500 yards from their camp. And she'll sit in this meadow and crochet and do things like this, sitting at the edge of the meadow in pine trees where she can't be seen, where it's cool and nice, and she sits there and knits real quietly, watching the meadow. And in doing this, she's been able to take 3 nice bull elk. But one night on her way back to camp, she said that it usually takes her about a half hour to get back to camp, and she had left, and she was just walking really slow back to her camp, and happened to walk around the trail. Went around a little corner. There's some pine trees, things, and she was walking on this trail and walked around this corner. She walked almost face to face with one of these big Utah wolves. The wolf was 20 yards away from her, standing in the trail on the meadow. They were standing there looking face to face at each other. She said that she was so scared when she realized what she was looking at and was standing there looking right at her. She was so scared she couldn't have shot that Utah wolf. She couldn't have raised that rifle to her shoulder. She explained to me that she was so petrified and so scared. And she said they stood there and looked at each other for maybe a minute. Now, a minute is a long time in that kind of a stressful situation. And the wolf then turned and was gone in a flash. They, over the years, her and her, now this was her alone, but on 2 other occasions, her and her husband, the old sheep herder, seen the pack of wolves on 2 other occasions. And so it is, what you've got here is you've got a sheep herder that's been around coyotes all of his life. Coyotes come into their flocks, kill some of their sheep. He shoots coyotes all of his life. He's listened to them serenade and sing to him probably most of the evenings all of his life long as he's been out there with these sheep in the mountains. And you know how coyotes are. They love to sing at night and howl and scream and things. But the noises that at times that he has heard, and his wife, and that I heard with my horse, and that in that situation, these were far from being coyotes. Coyotes have got a sharp, high-pitched howl. Wolves have a deep, low growl, very tremendous volume of a howl, and it's totally different. These were wolves in our UNM Mountains here in the state of Utah. And there's been a few other sightings by other people in Utah. I don't think Utah has very many wolves, but I do know that they do have a few. And they're not there to hurt anybody, they're just there to survive. But this was a neat experience. I often think about those wolves at night, and if I'm ever out late at dark in the Uinta Mountains anymore and I'm hunting and I haven't given myself enough time to get back to camp, I'll tell you, when it gets dark and I'm still a long ways from camp, the hair on the back of my neck stands up, goosebumps go up my back, and I vividly remember this experience with the wolves. Thanks, Michael and Shelley. I appreciate you asking me a few things about these wolves. This was really quite an interesting experience for me, and I'm pleased to share it with you. Story is a story here specifically tonight for Shelley Burton. She's interested in wolves and is doing a kind of a little research program on wolves. I had an encounter a few years ago. My name, by the way, is Gary Egbert. I'm 41 years old. I've done a lot of hunting in my life because it was the way I was raised. When I was a child at home, the only vacations we ever had with my father was a tremendous amount of hunting and fishing, and it got in my blood, I guess. I really enjoy it, and as I've grown up, I've had the opportunity to continue doing a lot of hunting and things. And this story I'm going to tell you about here in a few minutes happened to me in about 1978. Earlier that year in 1978, I've always had horses, and one of my big mountain horse was a Palomino gelding, and it got killed on the highway. It got out one night and got killed on the highway. So here I was, and that was in the first part of September. So here I was that year without a good riding horse. I still had some pack horses and a couple of riding horses that were not my favorites by far, and I was feeling kind of bad because this big Palomino I had for a lot of years, and it just carried me anywhere in some real rough hunting country, and we just had a real good rapport with each other and had a lot of confidence in that horse. When he got killed, in September, and hunting season was coming along, and there I was without a good hunting horse. But one of my friends that I've known for years had a few horses, and he had one sorrel mare. Her name was Coke, and she was a beautiful animal, and she was a good mountain horse. She was really well trained, and he called me up one day and he says, "You about ready to go hunting?" I says, "Gosh, yeah, I need to go do some hunting." And he says, "Come over here and get my mare and use her this year. I'm not going to use her. She's an extra horse for me, and she'll do you a wonderful job." So I did. I went over and picked her up, and what a nice animal. One of the finest horses I've ever rode in my life. I still have her today. I've run a lot of posse games with her and things like that, and she's just a beautiful, strong horse. I'm quite a big man, and she can carry me without even getting tired all day long in some real rough mountain country. This about October of that year. I'd had her about a month, and about October of that year, I had an opportunity to go into the wilderness area in the Uinta Mountains to hunt elk. We took the pack horses, and a friend of mine went with me, and we had a couple pack horses, a couple riding horses, and we went back into the wilderness area, north slope of the Uintas, and there we made a base camp. And then we hunted on horses and on foot for elk. Was in there for a period of about a week to 10 days. We'd been in there a while, had a nice camp made up, a beautiful little stream coming down by our camp. The weather was gorgeous. It wasn't really cold. The leaves were turned yellow, but it was just beautiful. One of the finest times of the year. We'd hunted a few days and we hadn't seen any elk. I got on this horse one day and went about, I would say 5, 6, 7 miles further back in the wilderness area there, and I tied her up and walked into this meadow that was sparsely covered with pines, and out in the middle of this big meadow was one of the largest pine trees I'd ever seen in the Uinta Mountains. It was a monster, and it was an old tree. Some of it was still alive, but it was so tall, and I guess there'd been a wind or something a few years before, and off to the one side of that there was 7 other, which I would consider big trees. They were not half as big as this monstrous tree. But this monstrous tree had started to fall, and it tipped into these 7 other trees, and it had started tipping them over. It was so big and heavy, and what had happened there was, instead of being straight up, it was about half laid down, where if you was real careful, it was like climbing a real steep mountain, but you could take a hold of the limbs and you could go from limb to limb, not like climbing straight up a tree, but almost like walking up the tree. And you could walk way up this tree, and up there probably 30 feet off the ground. A regular house is maybe, to the roof on a regular house, a 1-story house is probably 15 feet tall. So it would be like, oh golly, almost a 2 or 3-story building is how tall this tree went up there. And at that point, when I got that high, there was a limb that went out that was as big around as my waist, and it went out straight and then turned up, and it was almost like a seat. And here I was, I'd climbed that tree, and I could, from the top of that tree, sitting there or standing there on that big wide limb that was almost like a tree itself, that limb was so big, I could see for miles in this big valley, this big beautiful meadow. I could see some animals. I couldn't see any elk. At this time, this was like in the middle of the day, and which is the worst time of the day for hunting. Most of the animals are bedded down and things like that, and they're sleeping during the day and usually feed maybe in the early morning and evening. And I got thinking to myself, what a beautiful place this is. I'll bet if a guy was here early in the morning or late at night, I can see so far and it's such beautiful country, I'll bet I could see some elk right from the top of this tree. So anyway, I looked things over and I decided that maybe I'd come back there in a morning or an evening. And I went back down the tree and went over and got on the horse and rode off and finished hunting the day and went back to camp. It must have been maybe a couple of days later that I'd hunted an area in the morning and then went back to camp and fixed me a nice lunch and things, and I got thinking, boy, tonight would sure be a good night to go up and stand in that tree and watch that valley, and hopefully maybe an elk would come by, because I could see so much further from the top of that tree than I could from on the ground. Just opened up that whole country to my vision. And so I did. I saddled my horse, rode up there, and I tied her. I didn't want to get too close to that meadow and hope maybe I wouldn't scare anything, so I tied her probably 2 blocks. Most everybody knows how far a block is. It's, it takes you a minute to walk a block or walk around the block, and so I tied my horse far enough away that I didn't think she'd make any noise and scare the elk, and I took my rifle, my coat, a little lunch, because I knew I'd be there until almost dark, and a few other things I needed, and I took off on foot to walk through the pine trees and way over and down in the middle of this meadow to this big monstrous tree. At this time I was totally unaware that about 5 hours from then would be one of the experiences in my life that probably will never ever have the opportunity to be repeated. It was quite a scary experience. Excuse me. But anyway, I went, got to the base of this tree and put my rifle across my back on the sling so I could walk up this tree. had my lunch and a few things there and a jacket and things. And at this time it was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I wanted to get there plenty early before the animals started moving around, and so I could be quiet and situated, and so they would not detect that I was there. There wouldn't be a problem. I climbed that big beautiful tree, and I was sitting up there 30 feet off the ground, and I had waited and waited, and time was going by, and I kept searching every inch of the country with my eyes hoping to see an elk, but that evening I never seen an elk. I never seen a deer. To the best of my recollection, I don't think I even seen a squirrel. And maybe not even a bird. There was no animals moving in that whole area that I could see. And it was quiet and it was peaceful. Fact is, when you're sitting in an area like that and it's so peaceful and quiet, sometimes you'll even close your eyes and doze a little bit. But the time went by, and at that time of the year in October, it gets dark probably about 7 o'clock at night. And it was about 6 o'clock, quarter after 6, and I was there. It was still quiet and peaceful, and the shadows were getting long, and it was getting evening, and it was maybe 45 minutes left until dark, and I was starting to think about leaving and getting back to my horse, and thinking about the ride back down through that wilderness area to our base camp. And I really wanted to get to camp just about dark. It's really no fun to be out in a wilderness area, in kind of a strange area like that, way deep in the mountains after dark. It's easy to become lost, and it's a habit you try to get into, to where you can plan things to where you're back safe and sound at your camp before it gets really, really black dark. So I was up in that tree and thinking, gosh, I better get down, and I better start back to the horse and start riding. And then I'd tell myself, oh, wait just a minute. Wait another minute or two, and maybe you'll get that elk. I wanted to get that elk so bad. And I kept putting it off and putting it off. And finally I had about 30 minutes left before dark. So I got my jacket, and I'd put my jacket on, and I adjusted the sling on my rifle so it fit back across my shoulders and back so I could climb down that tree. And I'd ate my lunch, and I picked up my little lunch sack and a few things. I didn't want to leave any garbage around there or anything, and I was just about ready to start down that tree when I heard one of the most horrible screams I've ever heard in my life. All of a sudden I heard my horse give out a desperate, desperate scream. I heard a wolf let out a great big, deep, long, drawn out howl. And believe it or not, the chills went up my back so bad. Have you ever had goosebumps? I had goosebumps go from my head to my feet. I had goosebumps go from my head to my feet. My hair on the back of my neck stood straight up, and I could not believe what I was hearing. Another second, and there was 2 deep growling howls. Then it was 3, then it was 4 distinct voices that I was hearing. These were wolves in our Uinta Mountains right here in the state of Utah. Mixed into those horrible howls and screams, I could hear my horse. It was screaming. It was a sound. If you've ever, maybe you haven't been around horses very much, but they whinny and they talk, through whinnying and things like that. And most of the time, that's about all the noise you hear them make. But if you have ever seen or been near a horse when that horse was in trouble, or that horse was scared, or something was wrong, they can make tremendous amount of noise. I could hear her paws striking rocks. I could hear her screaming, and it dawned on me that those wolves were after that horse, and not a matter of just harassment. But those wolves were going to kill that horse. 3 or 4 things went through my mind. Now bear in mind the things I'm telling you right now all happened in just a fraction of a second. I didn't stay in that tree very long to think about what I was going to do or anything else. This all happened in just a matter of a second. But anyway, I realized that, hey, that's my buddy's horse over there that he lent me. Those wolves are going to tear its hind legs and what's called hamstring. When a wolf wants to kill an animal, the first thing they do is they attack its hind legs and they bite through the hamstring. This cripples the back leg and the animal cannot escape, and then the wolves can bring it down and mortally wound it, and there's the meal for the wolves. In desperation, when I realized what was happening, I sailed down that tree. Instead of going from limb to limb, I literally ran down and jumped probably the last 10 feet right out of the tree. I hit the ground, I rolled. I didn't even know it at that time. I tore the flesh in the palm of my hand, catching one of the limbs as I went down. But I gathered up my stuff and I was in a flat, desperate run straight towards that horse, and I probably had 150 to 200 yards to go to get there. I have never ran so fast or so hard in my life. And as I started to run for that horse, I thought, by the time I get there, they'll have that horse crippled. That you can't believe the horrible noise that that pack of wolves was making and the screaming of that horse. So what I did when I thought I got close enough, in just a matter of seconds of running as fast as I could, I figured, if the wolves know I'm coming, I might be able to save her. So I started screaming. Get away from my horse, you rotten little wolves! Only the words I was using wasn't you nice little wolves. I was using a little bit of profanity, and I was screaming as loud as I could. I wasn't worried about the wolves bothering me when I got there. I was worried about scaring the wolves so they wouldn't cripple that horse. I had my rifle. I was a very comparable shot, a good marksman, and I wasn't really worried about myself. And I also knew that if the wolves could hear me, wolves being basically scared of a human being, that they would run away and I'd never see them anyway. And that's exactly what happened. I screamed as loud as I could and kept screaming until I reached my horse. Luckily, she was okay. It really did leave some scars on her as far as emotionally and mentally. When I got there, that horse was shaking so bad that she couldn't hardly stand up. Every muscle in her body was in convulsions. She was so scared and being harassed. The ground all the way around the pine tree where she had been tied was just like you'd went in there and plowed it, like a farmer had plowed it before he planted grain. From her hoofs and the wolves, there's big wolf tracks there. But she being able to kick at him and things like this, being tied, and me screaming, they had not bit her, tore her hindquarters or hurt her that way. And I tried to settle her down so that I could get her out of there, but it took a few minutes of talking to her and petting her and things that way, and that before I could get her to quit shaking enough that I could get on her back, mount her, and ride out of that country. But what I seen when I got there was almost unbelievable, and that is, to see that horse so scared that every muscle in her body was full of convulsions and shaking so bad that she could not hardly stand. She was so scared. Anyway, I threw my rifle in the scabbard on the saddle, grabbed the halter rope, untied her from the pine tree, threw the reins or the bridles up over her neck, swung into the saddle. Believe it or not, that horse was like a grease strike of lightning. That horse and I went out of that wilderness area so fast you couldn't believe it. There was, I had control of her, but she wanted to get out of that country so fast and so bad. We did make it back to camp, even because I stayed there longer and had the trouble with the wolves. We made it back to camp by dark. And I've never had any nightmares about the situation, but I've often wondered about those wolves. And I've got something else to tell you about right here. Hunting in that wilderness area up there, I've been in there about, probably seven different times in hunting. There's an old sheep herder and his wife that hunt that same area. Now, he's from Roosevelt, Utah, and Roosevelt, Utah is on the south side of the Uinta Mountains, but there's only from where going in the north side, you're only probably about from where we camp, you're only about a 4-hour ride on your horse up over the divide and down the other side until you're in the area that he herded sheep all his life on the south slope. But he drives around the whole end of the mountain, comes in on the north slope, takes his pack horses and goes back there with his wife and makes a big camp and hunts there every single year for a long time. He used to come in from his own property on the south slope and ride up over that pass, but one year he got caught in a snowstorm. He was not able to get back across that pass, and it scared him so bad that he goes out of his way and drives clear around the mountain so that he doesn't have to go over that pass, because at that time of year in October you never know when there will be such a big snowstorm come in that he didn't want to get trapped there again like that. So he goes out of his way. But over the years I've really made some good friends from those two people. They've been really good friends to me is what I'm trying to say. Now he's really quite an old man. He's probably 75 and his wife is probably around 70, 72. And that's quite old to go in there and hunt all by yourselves, and it's really quite a unique situation, and they're lovely people. And I become good enough friends with them that whenever I go in there hunting and I ride past their camp, it's always, "How are you, Gary?" and get off and spend a minute with us. And the first thing she does is she always grabs a plate and opens a Dutch oven hanging over the fire and fixes me a big plate of nice hot stew or chicken and dumplings or something that she's cooked there. And gosh, it's nice to have a nice hot meal that far back in the wilderness area, and that's really become a treat to me. I really appreciate those people. But in talking to them, the reason I bring them up is they had, over the years, they had 2 experiences with wolves in that same area, and as far as I'm concerned, it would be the same pack of wolves. This lady that I'm telling you about, she's a sheep herder's wife and been raised rough, been raised out herding sheep and things like that, and she carries a 30-30 rifle, and she carries it like a man. She's very adept to that rifle. She's an accomplished marksman. She'd probably shoot the eye out of a hawk at 300 yards. She's really a neat lady. I've got a lot of respect for her. But what she would do is she would leave their camp, and she had over through the pine trees and down through this little gully and things. Then it got into another string of meadows. And she loved to go over there about noon, and she'd take her knitting. And she'd go down and sit in these meadows and sit over in the pine trees in the shade and kind of watch the meadows. And doing this over the years, she had been successful in taking 2 or 3 really nice big bull elk that would come in that meadow to feed, and it was her favorite little place. She'd take her sewing or crocheting or knitting, whatever she was doing, and she'd go sit in the peaceful, quiet meadow there at the edge, and she'd crochet and do these things while she was watching for animals and things like this, and while she was hunting elk. This one night, she was telling me this story about this one night when she had left the meadow about a half hour before dark. It took her a half hour to get back to camp, so she had left and she was walking back to camp real quiet and things. She walked around a bend in the trail, and standing not 20 yards from her was one of these great big wolves, right in, like I'm telling you, right in our own Uinta Mountains, right in the state of Utah. It wasn't no big police dog or husky dog or wolf. 20 yards in front of her, standing there, looking her right straight in the face. She said that she's never been so scared in her life. The wolf looked at her. She said she was so scared she couldn't move. She didn't think about shooting it. She was so scared, she said she didn't think she could have got her rifle to her shoulder. All of a sudden, to walk around a corner and be face to face with a wolf, something that is not supposed to have been in the state of Utah for years and years and years, all of a sudden was standing looking her right in the face. She said that that wolf was not aggressive as far as growling or chasing her or something like that. She said it stood there quiet, looked her right in the face for probably a minute, and a minute is a long time in a stressful situation like that. The wolf turned and disappeared. And she told me that in hunting up there, they had hunted there for 17 years. And in hunting there for 17 years, she had seen this wolf. They had heard the wolves before, and she had seen those wolves and her husband also on 2 other occasions. Now you've got an old sheep herder that's herded sheep in the mountains all his life. He's always been familiar with coyotes. And I've had some people say, gosh, Gary, you sure those wasn't coyotes up there that was harassing your horse? Okay. I have never been involved with the coyotes that would harass a horse when it was saddled, when it had man smell all over it, things like this. And besides, I've heard coyotes all my life in different circumstances in the mountains and things. And there's a totally different sound between the sharp bark of a coyote and the low, deep growl and gruff voice and howl of a wolf. This old sheep herder had been involved, him and his wife had been involved in sheep all their lives with coyotes that come in and kill their sheep. He was very familiar with the sound of coyotes he'd heard since he was a boy. And this is an old 75-year-old man. He was familiar with coyotes. These were wolves, they were not coyotes. Totally different sound in their howling. I've hunted in there a lot of other times since then, but that is the only time I've ever been involved with those wolves. I've never seen them after that. I never heard them after that. A couple of years later, I was hunting back in the same area. When I got to the area pretty close to where those wolves had attacked that horse, riding the same horse at the time, you can't believe what that horse did. That horse was as scared 2 years after that in the same area as she was at the time the wolves attacked her. She hadn't forgot the area, she hadn't forgot the situation. It was kind of interesting to note that that horse knew what had happened there to her in the same area 2 years ago. And I've had her in lots of other mountain canyons, lots of other hunting times and experiences. I still have that same horse today. I still hunt with her today. But it was real interesting to know that 2 years later, she still remembered. And I could tell that by how nervous she got and how antsy and how she wanted to get out of there so bad. Shelley, I hope you've enjoyed this. I don't think there's many people in the state of Utah that's ever had this experience, and I hope that this helps you with your school assignment. This is Gary Egbert, and thanks, Shelley, for asking me to tell you a little bit about my wolf experience.